The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on Earth. 9 million square kilometers of sand, rock, and wind. Temperatures that hit 60 degrees in summer and drop below zero at night. No water, no roads, no mercy. For most people, the Sahara is a barrier, a place to go around. For one people, it has always been home. They call themselves the Kel Tamashek, the people of the Tamashek language. The world calls them the Tuareg, and for 3,000 years they have owned the desert. The Tuareg are a Berber people, descendants of the ancient North African populations who inhabited the Sahara long before the Arab conquest of the 7th century. Today, they number between 3 and 5 million people, spread across 6 countries: Algeria, Libya, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. But numbers and borders barely capture what the Tuareg are. The Tuareg are nomads, or at least they were. For most of their history, they moved with their camels and goats across the Sahara and the Sahel, following ancient routes known only to them, trading across distances that would have seemed impossible to settled peoples. Their society is organised into confederations, loose groupings of clans united by common ancestry, dialect, and territory. These confederations had names that echoed across the medieval world: the Kel Ahagar of southern Algeria, the Kel Air of northern Niger, the Kel Ada of northern Mali. And then there is the veil, the tagelmust, the indigo-dyed cloth that Tuareg men wrap around their heads and faces, is one of the most recognisable images in all of African culture. It is so associated with the Tuareg that they are often called the blue people of the Sahara, because the indigo dye historically stained their skin. But the tagelmust is not just aesthetic. It is identity, protection, and honour. A Tuareg man traditionally does not remove his veil in front of strangers or elders. It is worn from puberty until death. In Tuareg society, unlike most of the world, it is the men who are veiled, not the women. To understand the Tuareg, you have to go back to a Sahara that no longer exists. As we explored in our video on the Fulani, roughly 11,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Rivers flowed, lakes sparkled, savanna stretched where dunes now stand. Cattle herding communities thrived across what is now the world's most hostile desert. As the Sahara dried, a process that accelerated from around 5,000 years ago, these communities were pushed to the margins. Some went south into West Africa. Some went east toward the Nile Valley. Some stayed. The ancestors of the Tuareg were among those who stayed and adapted, retreating to the high mountain massifs of the central Sahara, like the Ahagar in Algeria and the Air in Niger, where elevation brought cooler temperatures and occasional rainfall. These people were Berbers, part of the ancient Afro-Asiatic population that had inhabited North Africa for tens of thousands of years. They spoke Tamashek, a language in the Berber family with its own ancient script called Tifana, one of the oldest continuously used writing systems in the world, still written by Tuareg women today. While empires rose and fell around them, Egypt, Carthage, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, the Tuareg endured in the desert, masters of a landscape that defeated every army that tried to cross it. Their isolation preserved them, and their knowledge of the desert would eventually make them indispensable. Between roughly the 8th and 16th centuries, the trans-Saharan trade routes were among the most important commercial highways on Earth. Gold and enslaved people moved north from West Africa to the Mediterranean. Salt moved south from the Saharan mines at Taudeni and Timbuktu. Copper, cloth, horses, and manuscripts moved in all directions. And at the centre of all of it, controlling the routes, guiding the caravans, taxing the merchants, and enforcing order across thousands of kilometres of desert, were the Tuareg. The city of Agadez, founded in the 15th century in what is now northern Niger, became the greatest Tuareg city and one of the most important trading hubs in medieval Africa. At its peak, it was a city of 50,000 people. a cosmopolitan crossroads where Tuareg nobles, Hausa merchants, Arab scholars, and Songhai traders all met and did business. The Tuareg did not just facilitate this trade. They taxed it, protected it, and in many cases monopolized it. To cross the Sahara without Tuareg permission was to risk everything. With their permission, and for a fee, your caravan was as safe as anywhere on earth. This gave the Tuareg extraordinary power. Not the power of a centralized empire, but the power of indispensability. They were the ones who knew where the water was, the ones who could read the desert wind, the ones without whom the medieval global economy simply did not function. The Tuareg encountered Islam through the same trans-Saharan trade networks they controlled. By the 11th and 12th centuries, most Tuareg had converted, though, as with the Hausa and the Fulani, Islam blended with older Tuareg traditions in complex ways. Tuareg women, for instance, were never veiled or secluded in the way Islamic convention often required. They owned property, initiated divorce, composed poetry, and maintained the Tifinagh script as a feminine tradition. Tuareg Islam was and remains distinctly Tuareg. The Tuareg's relationship with the great Saharan empires, Mali, Songhai, Kanem-Bornu, was always complicated. They were simultaneously trading partners, tributaries, and threats. The Tuareg captured Timbuktu from the Mali Empire in 1433 and held it for decades before the rising Songhai Empire pushed them back. Then, in 1591, everything changed. A Moroccan army, equipped with firearms, crossing the Sahara from the north, invaded the Songhai Empire and shattered it at the Battle of Tondibi. The great Saharan trading system that had sustained the Tuareg for centuries began to collapse. The trans-Saharan trade routes did not disappear overnight, but the balance of power had shifted. Firearms had crossed the desert before the Tuareg had acquired them, and the slow decline of the overland trade, accelerated by the rise of European maritime routes around the West African coast, would gradually erode the economic foundation of Tuareg power. It would take another 300 years, but the long decline had begun. When European powers carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884, the Tuareg were not consulted. Their territory was divided between French Algeria, French Sudan, and French Niger. Artificial borders drawn by men who had never seen the Sahara and had no understanding of the migration routes, the water sources, or the social structures that Tuareg life depended on. The French encountered the Tuareg as one of the most formidable opponents in their entire colonial project. In 1881, a French military column under Colonel Paul Flatters was ambushed and annihilated by Tuareg warriors in the Algerian Sahara. It was one of the most complete military defeats in French colonial history, and a demonstration that the desert itself was a weapon in Tuareg hands. French conquest of the Tuareg territories took decades of brutal campaigning. The Tuareg mounted multiple major revolts. In 1916, during the First World War, the Tuareg of the Air region launched a major uprising that tied down thousands of French troops and was only suppressed after enormous violence on both sides. The French eventually imposed control, but they never fully pacified the Tuareg. And the borders they drew, cutting across ancient migration routes, separating related clans, enclosing Tuareg communities within states dominated by other ethnic groups, created tensions that would not resolve peacefully after independence. When France withdrew from West Africa in the early 1960s, the Tuareg found themselves citizens of new nations, Mali, Niger, Algeria, in which they were minorities, often marginalized, frequently discriminated against, and governed from distant capitals that had little understanding of or interest in desert nomads. The promises made during independence of political representation, economic development, respect for nomadic ways of life were not kept. The response was rebellion. The Tuareg have launched 5 major rebellions since independence, In Mali and Niger in the 1960s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and most devastatingly in 2012, when Tuareg fighters returning from Libya after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, where many had served as mercenaries, swept back into northern Mali with heavy weapons and military experience, and within months had captured the entire north of the country. For a brief period in 2012, the Mouvement National pour la Libération de l'Azawad, the MNLA, declared an independent Tuareg state called Azawad in northern Mali. It lasted less than a year. Jihadist groups allied to Al-Qaeda, who had fought alongside the Tuareg, turned on them and seized control of the territory. A French military intervention drove the jihadists back. The Azawad declaration was abandoned. The Tuareg found themselves caught between three forces simultaneously: the central governments of Mali and Niger, the French military, and jihadist organisations that had infiltrated their rebellion. It was a catastrophe. The Sahel today remains one of the most unstable regions in the world. Military coups in Mali in 2021 and Niger in 2023 have further destabilised the region. French forces have withdrawn, Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group have moved in, and the Tuareg, as always, are navigating a world that has changed around them faster than any treaty or border can account for. 3,000 years, 6 countries, 5 rebellions, 1 desert. The Tuareg have outlasted the Roman Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the French Empire, and every other power that tried to claim the Sahara as its own. They are still here. The world they were born into is changing faster than any generation before them has experienced. Climate change is altering the desert they know better than anyone. Political instability is making ancient migration routes dangerous. The nomadic life that sustained their culture for millennia is under pressure from every direction. And yet, the Tifinagh script is still being written. The Tagelmust is still being worn. The camels are still moving. The desert has always been the Tuareg's greatest ally. It defeated every army that came for them. It may yet defeat the forces that threaten them now. If this video changed how you see the Sahara, subscribe to TheKognos. The history of Africa is deeper, older, and more surprising than anything you were taught in school. And we are just getting started.